Welcome back to Spirits in the Shadow. What you're about to hear is inspired by a creepy urban legend that's been circulating online, originating in the misty mountains north of Seoul, South Korea. Locals whisper about the 411 bus, a route that only operates after midnight. In Korean, the number 4 sounds like the word for death, making its name a terrifying omen. Death, death, one. It's said that anyone who boards this bus will never be seen again. Is it just a story? Subscribe now, because we're about to find out exactly what happens on that deserted road. Seung-ho was 28, a fact that felt less like an age and more like a condition. He was the night manager of a small 24-hour convenience store in Ujeongbu, a city that rested quietly at the foot of the mountains, forever brushing against the edge of true wilderness. His life wasn't lived so much as it was repeated. A loop, a closed circuit of mundane actions. Wake up in the grey afternoon light, work through the deep silence of the night, fall asleep as the rest of the world began its day. Repeat. He lived alone in a gosiwon, a one-room apartment that was little more than a box. The rent was cheap, a necessary mercy, but it came at the cost of comfort. The walls were thin enough to hear his neighbour cough, yet they felt miles thick, insulating him in a profound, unshakable solitude. The room contained the entirety of his world. A single futon rolled out on the heated floor, a small folding table where he ate his instant noodles, a hot plate, and a stack of worn-out manhwa comics. There was nothing special about the space, no art on the cold walls, no pictures of family or friends. It was a place for sleeping, not for living, and he often blurred the line between the two. His work was the axis on which his meagre world turned. The convenience store was an island of sterile, fluorescent light in the dark sea of the night. He knew its rhythms intimately, the low, constant hum of the refrigerators, the cheerful but irritating jingle of the door sensor, the precise way the fluorescent tube above the snack aisle would flicker before settling into its harsh white glare. Most nights were a slow procession of solitary tasks. He would restock the triangular kimbap and milk cartons, meticulously arrange the brightly coloured chip bags, and wipe down the counters, erasing the faint smudges left by the day's customers. Customers after midnight were a rare and strange breed. Drunken salarymen fumbling for a bottle of hangover cure, pale-faced students pulling all-nighters fueled by energy drinks, or the occasional taxi driver stopping for a hot coffee. Seung-ho served them all with a practiced weary politeness. He was a ghost behind the counter, a silent observer of these brief, disconnected lives that drifted into his store and then vanished back into the night. He rarely spoke more than the necessary words. The price, a quiet thank you, a have a good night. They never looked at him, not really. He was just part of the scenery, as permanent and unremarkable as the cigarette display behind him. His purpose was simple, stripped down to its barest essentials. Work to earn money to pay rent to have a place to sleep, and sleep to have the energy to work. Love, ambition, travel. These were concepts from a different world. Things he saw in the dramas that played on the small television mounted in the corner of the store. Their vibrant, noisy lives a stark contrast to his own silent, grey existence. That night, a Tuesday in late October, the familiar rhythm was broken. His co-worker, a university student named Tai Min, had called in sick an hour before his shift was supposed to start. Seung-ho heard the feigned weakness in the young man's voice and didn't bother to argue. It meant he had to stay late, covering the first few hours of the morning shift and, worst of all, finishing the monthly inventory count alone. The task was mind-numbing. He walked the aisles with a scanner, its sharp red beam cutting through the quiet air. Beep! 1 box of Pepero. Beep! 1 carton of banana milk. Beep! A 6-pack of Cass beer. Each beep was a tick of the clock, pushing him further into the dead of night. He worked methodically, his movements economical and practiced. He found a strange, almost meditative comfort in the routine, a way to turn off his mind and just exist as a pair of hands, counting and scanning. By the time he scanned the last cup of instant ramen in the storeroom, the clock above the door read 2:15 a.m. A wave of exhaustion, deep and bone-heavy, washed over him. His shift had ended hours ago. All he wanted was the oblivion of his futon. He cashed out the register, locked the excess cigarettes in the safe, and began the final closing procedures. He turned off the coffee machine, its gurgling sigh sounding like the store itself was settling down for a rest. He dragged the trash bags to the curb, and then, finally, pulled down the heavy metal shutters. The clatter echoed down the empty street, a sound of absolute finality. He turned the key in the lock, the cold metal biting into his fingers, and was plunged into the sudden, stark contrast of the outside world. The air was freezing, a sharp, clear cold that promised the coming of winter. It sliced through his thin jacket, and he instinctively hunched his shoulders, pulling his collar tighter around his neck. The street was dead silent. The usual hum of Uijeongbu had ceased, leaving an unnerving vacuum of sound. Every building was dark, every window a blind eye. His was the only presence on the entire block. He saw his breath plume in the air, a fleeting ghost in the orange glow of a lone streetlight. He walked quickly, his worn work shoes making a soft, rhythmic tapping on the pavement. The bus stop was 2 blocks away. As he got closer, a knot of anxiety tightened in his stomach. He was cutting it dangerously close. The sign at the stop was old and faded, the plastic cover cracked. He squinted at the timetable, his finger tracing the lines under the dim light. The last bus, 4:11, his bus, the only one that went up the winding hill to his neighborhood, was scheduled to pass at 2:30 a.m. He checked his phone. 2:28 a.m. A cold dread, far more chilling than the night air, washed over him. 2 minutes. He had 2 minutes. Missing it wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a sentence. The alternative was a 1-hour walk uphill, through a poorly lit road that cut through the edge of the forest. The thought of that walk, the deep, oppressive darkness between the sparse streetlights, the rustling sounds from the unseen woods, the sheer, exhausting climb, filled him with a primal fear. He was too tired, too cold, too exposed. He stared down the long, empty road, straining his ears for the telltale rumble of a diesel engine. Nothing. Only the whisper of the wind rattling the bare branches of a nearby tree. There was no choice. He started to run. His backpack bounced awkwardly against his shoulders, and his lungs immediately began to burn as they sucked in the frigid air. The streetlights became blurry streaks of yellow. His own frantic footsteps were the only sound in the universe, a desperate drumbeat against the silent, unforgiving asphalt. He had to make it. He just had to catch the last ride home. The hour hand had long since completed its slow crawl past 2 in the morning, leaving the world in a state of deep, dreamless slumber. For him, however, sleep was a distant shore. He stood under the sickly orange buzz of a lone streetlight, a solitary figure on an empty avenue. The silence was so profound, it felt like a weight, pressing in on him from all sides. He checked his watch for the 10th time. 2:27 a.m. The last bus was late, and a thread of genuine panic was beginning to weave itself through his exhaustion. Then, a distant rumble grew into a low growl, and 2 points of light cut through the gloom. The road ahead shimmered under the weak streetlights as the headlights bore down. The bus arrived, its engine not so much roaring as groaning, like a great beast waking from a long and troubled sleep. A wave of profound relief washed over him, so potent it almost buckled his knees. He was not stranded after all. As it drew nearer, however, the initial relief began to curdle. Small, unsettling detail. The vehicle was ancient, a relic from a forgotten era. The paint, once likely a cheerful public transit red, was now a faded, peeling scab of rust and maroon. The rubber seals around the windows were cracked and dry rotted, and the glass itself was hazed over, not with dirt, but with a strange, milky fog that seemed to emanate from within. There was no route number displayed in the illuminated sign box. It was simply dark, a hollow void. Character ignores, rationalizes it. He hesitated for only a second. It's the last bus of the night. What did I expect? A luxury coach, he thought, a grim smile touching his lips. They probably just run the oldest piece of junk in the depot for the graveyard shift. It made a certain kind of miserable sense. He was too tired, too cold, to afford being picky. Audience senses it's a warning, but every detail screamed that this was wrong. Public transport is uniform, regulated, predictable. This bus was an anomaly, a ghost from a junkyard, running a route that didn't exist, appearing from the darkness not as a service, but as a predator. Comment. The choice to step aboard is the first and most critical mistake. The moment the character willingly crosses a threshold he didn't even know was there, trading the safety of the known world for the promise of a ride home. The pneumatic doors hissed open with a sigh of stale air, and he boarded. The interior was dim, lit by a few flickering yellowed panels, and the smell, it hit him instantly. Small, unsettling detail. It wasn't the familiar urban perfume of stale cigarette smoke, damp wool, and gasoline. This was a thick, heavy odour, the scent of wet, overturned soil and rotting leaves, of deep woods after a long rain. It was the smell of a freshly opened grave. Character ignores, rationalizes it. He wrinkled his nose. Someone must have been hiking or gardening and tracked in a load of mud. It was an odd time of night for that, but it was the only explanation that made sense. He mentally catalogued the possibilities: a landscaper on a late shift, a drunk who'd passed out in a park. His mind scrambled for the mundane because the alternative was too primal. Audience senses, it's a warning. That smell is not a byproduct of a passenger's activity. It is the bus's own atmosphere. It is the scent of decay, of things that should be buried and still. The air inside this space is not meant for the living to breathe. Comment. The senses are our first line of defense, the ancient alarms that tell us when we are in the presence of sickness and death. By consciously ignoring what his nose is screaming at him, he is disarming himself, choosing logic over instinct. His eyes, adjusting to the gloom, scanned the interior. There were 7 other passengers, 7 silent figures scattered amongst the cracked vinyl seats, their postures strangely rigid. They sat in perfect isolation, not a single one looking at a phone, reading a book, or even staring out the window. They just sat. Small, unsettling detail. As he moved down the aisle, he noticed the windows again, this time from the inside. The milky fog he'd seen from the street was a thick film of condensation, but it was on the interior of the glass. It was so heavy that little rivulets of moisture trickled down, carving clean paths through the grime. The air outside was cold and dry. The air inside was clammy and dense, with a humidity that had no source. Character ignores, rationalizes it. Broken heating system, he concluded immediately. The condenser must be shot. It's pumping moist air into a cold bus. Typical. He chose a seat midway down, deliberately keeping his jacket on and avoiding contact with the damp, sticky-feeling window. It was just one more misery to endure on this God-forsaken ride. Audience senses it's a warning. The condensation is not mechanical. It is biological. It is the collective exhalation of something that isn't breathing air. It is the environment itself sweating with a cold fever, the barrier between the occupants and the outside world becoming opaque. trapping them in its terrarium of dread. Comment. This detail transforms the bus from a mere vehicle into a sealed environment, a rolling tomb. The world outside is being erased, window by window, leaving him alone with the things inside. As he settled, he tried a gesture of civility, a small anchor to the normal world. He gave a polite, shallow bow to an elderly woman sitting across the aisle near the front. She wore a simple, dark dress, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her hair was a neat, silver bun. Small, unsettling detail. She didn't react, not a flicker of an eyelid, not a twitch of her lips. Her eyes were open, fixed on the seat back in front of her, but they were coated with a dull, cataract-like sheen that didn't seem to reflect the dim light at all. They were like frosted glass marbles. Character ignores, rationalizes it. Weird, he thought, a prickle of discomfort on his neck. Maybe she's asleep with her eyes open. Some people do that. Or perhaps she was deaf, or just lost in thought. He felt a flush of embarrassment for trying to engage her and quickly looked away, focusing on his own worn shoes. It was rude to stare, especially at the elderly. Audience senses it's a warning. Sleep is a state of relaxation. Her posture is one of rigid tension. Her eyes are not vacant with thought. They are void of it. She is not a passenger. She is an object, a piece of taxidermy placed carefully on a seat, and her stillness is a silent, shrieking alarm. Comment. The breakdown of social contract is a powerful tool in horror. A nod unanswered, a greeting ignored. These small tears in the fabric of a normalcy are often more disturbing than overt threats because they suggest the rules no longer apply. The bus pulled away from the curb with a lurch, its engines groan deepening. He gripped the metal pole beside his seat for support. Small, unsettling detail. The pole wasn't cold with the biting chill of metal on a late autumn night. It was cool, yes, but with a strange, organic clamminess, as if it were coated in a fine, invisible layer of slime. Beneath his fingers, the surface felt faintly porous, not smooth like worn steel. Character ignores and rationalizes it. He instinctively recoiled, wiping his hand on his trousers. Ugh, filthy. He imagined the countless sweaty, grimy hands that had gripped this pole over the decades. It probably hadn't been properly cleaned since it was installed. He made a mental note not to touch anything else. Audience senses it's a warning. The textures are wrong. The bus is not a machine of metal, plastic, and glass. It is a thing of flesh and bone, masquerading as a machine. What he touched was not dirty steel. It was something else. Something that felt like cold, damp skin or the surface of a fungus growing in a dark place. Comment. The story now attacks the sense of touch, the most intimate of the senses. He has made physical contact with the wrongness, and a part of it is now, quite literally, on him. The contamination has begun. The ancient bus rumbled its way up the winding mountain pass, its engine a low, guttural growl against the oppressive silence of the forest. The windows trembled in their frames, each vibration a tiny earthquake that rattled Seung-ho's teeth. Outside, the world was a black canvas smeared with the dark, jagged shapes of pine trees, their silhouettes like skeletal fingers clawing at the moonless sky. He pulled the thin collar of his jacket tighter, a futile gesture against a chill that seemed to emanate not from the night air, but from the very bones of the bus itself. That's when Seung-ho first noticed it, a detail so out of place it felt like a glitch in reality. It was getting cold. Not the simple, creeping cold of a poorly heated vehicle, but an invasive, biting frost that sank deep into his marrow. It was a dead cold, the kind he imagined you'd find in a morgue. He could see his own breath, a plume of white vapour ghosting in the dim interior light. He rubbed his hands together, the friction generating a pathetic warmth that was instantly swallowed by the encroaching freeze. The metal poles supporting the seats were slick with condensation, and a delicate, crystalline layer of ice had begun to form on the inside of the windows, obscuring the already terrifying darkness outside. This wasn't right. A bus this old should be blasting out stale, overheated air. He glanced at the other passengers. A handful of them were scattered throughout the seats, solitary figures shrouded in the gloom. An elderly woman with a shawl, a businessman with his briefcase on his lap, a young student with headphones. None of them seemed to notice. They didn't shiver, didn't pull their coats tighter, didn't even blink. They just stared straight ahead, their expressions as blank and still as portraits in a forgotten gallery. A knot of anxiety tightened in his stomach. He had to do something. Pushing himself out of the worn vinyl seat, he stumbled down the aisle, his feet unsteady as the bus lurched around another hairpin turn. He gripped the back of a seat for balance and whispered, "Excuse me," toward the driver's imposing silhouette. There was no answer. The only sound was the groan of the engine and the rattling of the windows. Seung-ho took another step closer, his voice a little louder now, laced with a tremor he couldn't control. "Sir?" "Excuse me, sir." The driver remained a statue, a monolith of stillness. His hands were locked on the steering wheel, his knuckles pale and rigid. He didn't so much as twitch. Seung-ho could only see the back of his head and his reflection in the large rear-view mirror, a pair of eyes that stared, unblinking, into the road ahead. "Sir, the heater," Seung-ho began, his voice trailing off as he leaned closer. "It's freezing in here." The words hung in the frigid air, unheard and unanswered. It was then that the bus jerked to a violent stop, throwing Seung-ho forward against a seat post. The engine didn't die. It idled with a low, predatory hum. He looked out the frosted windshield. There was no stop sign, no traffic lights, no town. There was nothing but the dense, impenetrable wall of the forest. A faint, dry, scraping sound made him turn. A young woman in a simple white dress, who had been sitting 3 rows behind him, rose from her seat. Her movements were wrong, stiff, jerky, and unnatural, like a marionette being clumsily handled by an unseen puppeteer. Her head was tilted at a slight angle, and her eyes were wide and vacant. She walked down the aisle, her footsteps making no sound on the metal floor. She didn't look at Seung-ho. She didn't look at anyone. She stopped at the front door, with a pneumatic hiss that sounded like a final exhale. The door swung open, revealing a gaping maw of absolute darkness. A gust of wind, impossibly colder than the air inside, swept through the cabin, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decay. Without hesitation, the woman stepped off the bus and was immediately swallowed by the night. The door hissed shut behind her. A beat of silence. Then, with a lurch, the bus moved again, resuming its laborious climb up the mountain as if nothing had happened. Seung-ho's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He whipped his head around, his eyes wide with disbelief and terror, searching the faces of the other passengers for any sign of shared alarm. He found none. The businessman continued his vacant stare. The elderly woman hadn't moved a muscle. The student's head was still bobbing slightly, though Seung-ho now realized there was no music coming from his headphones. 6 passengers were left. None of them had reacted. It was as if the woman in the white dress had never existed. Did you see that?" Seung-ho choked out, his voice a ragged whisper aimed at the businessman sitting across the aisle. "A woman. She just got off. In the middle of nowhere." The businessman's eyes remained fixed on the seat in front of him. He didn't blink. He didn't breathe. Seung-ho wasn't even sure he was alive. Panic, cold, and sharp, pierced through him. Was he dreaming? Was he losing his mind? He had to be sure. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the businessman's shoulder. The fabric of his suit was cold and stiff, and underneath it, the man's flesh was hard and icy, like frozen meat. Seung-ho snatched his hand back with a gasp. The bus groaned to another sudden violent stop. Again, there was nothing outside but trees. The pneumatic hiss echoed through the cabin again as the door swung open. This time, an old man with a weathered face and thin grey hair stood up. His movements mirrored the woman's, the same stiff robotic motion, the same empty gaze. He shuffled down the aisle, his shoes scuffing silently, and stepped out into the black void of the forest. The door closed. The bus lurched forward. The pattern was undeniable. This was a nightmare given form and motion. He was trapped on a conveyor belt to hell, and the other passengers were not passengers at all. They were cargo. 5 left. Seung-ho scrambled back to his seat, fumbling in his pocket for his phone. His fingers were numb with cold and fear, but he finally managed to pull it out. No signal. Of course. He tried the emergency call function. Failed. He was utterly, completely alone. He looked wildly around the cabin. The frost on the windows was thicker now, sealing him in, turning the bus into a rolling crypt. The faces of the remaining passengers were like wax masks, their eyes glassy and fixed. He looked back at the driver's reflection in the rear-view mirror, and a scream lodged in his throat. The driver's eyes were not looking at the road. They were staring directly back at him, perfectly white and devoid of pupils. The bus rumbled on, climbing ever higher into the suffocating darkness, carrying its silent, unblinking passengers to a destination Seung-ho knew he would do anything to avoid. The bus groaned, its engine straining like an old man's heart as it hauled itself up the winding mountain pass. With every hairpin turn, the world outside the dirt-streaked windows became a blur of dark, indistinguishable trees and jagged rock faces. Seung-ho had lost all sense of direction an hour ago. The familiar landmarks of the countryside had dissolved into a monotonous, threatening wilderness. He clutched his phone, the smooth case slick with sweat in his palm. He'd been watching the signal bars dwindle one by one, a slow countdown to complete isolation. Finally, the last bar flickered and died, replaced by the stark, unforgiving words, "No service." A knot of unease tightened in his stomach. It wasn't just the lack of a signal. It was the suffocating silence that came with it, a silence that seemed to press in on the bus from all sides. The hiss of the hydraulic brakes broke the quiet. The bus shuddered to a halt in the middle of nowhere, the red glow of its taillights painting the asphalt like pools of blood. An old man, his back bent into a permanent question mark, slowly shuffled down the aisle and stepped off into the pitch-black night. There was no bus stop, no waiting car, no house, nothing but the oppressive darkness of the forest. Seung-ho watched him go, a shiver tracing its way down his spine. Before he could process the strangeness of it, the bus lurched forward again, only to stop 100 meters down the road. This time, a woman in a plain dress disembarked, her face a pale, emotionless mask. She too was swallowed by the night. And then it happened again. Another passenger, a young man in a hoodie, got off and vanished. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Seung-ho's confusion. This wasn't right. They were in the middle of a mountain pass with nothing around for miles. He jumped to his feet, his voice cracking as he yelled toward the front of the bus. "Hey, what's going on? Where are you dropping people off?" The remaining handful of passengers didn't stir. They sat perfectly still, their heads facing forward as if they hadn't heard him. The driver offered no reply, his silhouette a rigid statue behind the massive steering wheel. The only sound was the low, rumbling idle of the engine. Seung-ho's heart hammered against his ribs. He took a step forward, his voice louder this time, laced with a desperation he couldn't hide. I asked you a question. Stop the bus. What is this? For a long, agonizing moment, there was nothing. Then, with a slowness that seemed to defy the laws of anatomy, the driver's head began to turn. It rotated on his neck with a faint, dry crackle, like old parchment being crumpled. The movement was stiff, unnatural, and when his face finally came into view, Seung-ho's breath hitched in his throat. His eyes, they were completely, utterly black. Two glossy obsidian orbs, devoid of whites, irises, or pupils. They were like holes bored into the fabric of reality, leading to an endless, starless void. His skin was the colour of settled ash, a lifeless grey canvas stretched taut over the sharp angles of his skull. His lips, thin and bloodless, parted slightly. Final destination approaching, the voice droned. It was a sound that didn't seem to come from a human throat, but from somewhere else entirely. A hollow, echoing whisper from the bottom of a deep, empty well. It was the sound of the grave. Seung-ho stumbled backward, his legs suddenly weak. He bumped into a seat, his mind reeling as it struggled to piece together the nightmare unfolding before him. The realization crashed over him with the force of a physical blow, so cold and terrifying it stole the air from his lungs. The driver, he wasn't human, and if he wasn't human... As if cued by his unspoken thought, the other passengers began to move. In a single, horrifyingly synchronized motion, their heads turned toward him. One by one, he saw their eyes, the same bottomless black pits as the drivers. Their faces, which had seemed so normal just moments before, were now canvases of grey decay. A low moan, a collective exhalation of ancient sorrow and hunger, filled the cabin of the bus. "No," Seung-ho whispered, his throat raw and dry. "No, you're not real." He turned and scrambled for the doors, his fumbling hands slapping against the cold metal. He slammed his palm on the button to open them, but nothing happened. He pushed and pulled at the handles, his terror escalating into a frantic, primal scream. The doors were sealed shut, as if welded to the frame. The bus was no longer a vehicle. It was a tomb. He spun around, pressing his back against the unyielding doors. The things that were once passengers were rising from their seats. Their movements were jerky and disjointed, their limbs twitching at odd angles like poorly handled marionettes. They were a silent, advancing army of the dead, and he was their sole living target. Their black eyes were fixed on him, a unified gaze of absolute malevolence. Seung-ho's eyes darted to the windows. Escape. He had to escape. He lunged for the nearest one, pulling at the emergency release latch. It wouldn't budge. He balled his fist and hammered against the glass, expecting it to shatter, but his knuckles met a surface as hard and unforgiving as solid steel. A web of frost, intricate as a spider's web, instantly bloomed from the point of impact, spreading across the pane. Within the frost, he could see faint, screaming faces swirling and contorting in silent agony. The bus began to pick up speed, its engine now a deafening roar. The scenery outside became an insane, whipping vortex of black and green. The vehicle careened down the mountain road at an impossible velocity, yet Seung-ho felt no inertia. He was frozen in place as the spectres closed in, their grey, skeletal hands reaching for him. The air grew frigid, smelling of damp earth and something else. Something sweet and rotten, the scent of forgotten decay. The first one reached him. Its icy fingers didn't grab him, but passed through his arm. A soul-shattering coldness flooded his body, a parasitic chill that seemed to leach the warmth and life directly from his marrow. He cried out, a thin, reedy sound, as another ghostly figure drifted through his chest. His heart fluttered wildly, his vision swam, and his strength evaporated like mist in the sun. He was being consumed, erased, his life force a feast for the damned. He collapsed to the floor, the world dissolving into a grey, freezing fog. Through the haze, he could see the driver's face reflected in the rearview mirror. Its black, empty eyes stared directly into his, and a silent, lipless smile stretched across its ashen face. The windshield was no longer a window to the road. It was a screen, and on it played a vision of his final destination. A desolate, barren wasteland under a bruised twilight sky, littered with the skeletal remains of countless other buses. This wasn't a route, it was a harvest. And his soul was the crop. What horrors await at the final destination? Will Seung-ho become another ghost on the bus? Or is there a way out of this hellish ride? Let me know your theories in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for the next chapter. You won't want to miss what happens next. The hiss of the air brakes was a final damning sigh. The bus stopped, not at a designated stop with a rain-streaked shelter and a flickering street lamp, but in the middle of a nowhere defined by the absolute absence of light. Outside wasn't merely the darkness of a country road at night. It was a profound and hungry nothingness, a physical presence that seemed to drink the very air from the bus. It was a void, and Seung-ho felt it pulling at him, a silent siren's call not to his ears, but to the very marrow of his bones. His body, no longer his own, began to move. The betrayal was absolute. His mind screamed a litany of refusal, a frantic, silent prayer to his own limbs, but his muscles contracted with a sickening smoothness that was not his own. One foot lifted, planting itself in the aisle with a soft thud. Then the other. One step. 2 steps. He was a marionette, and the driver, a shadowy figure whose face he could never quite see, was the puppet master. The force was irresistible, a heavy, syrupy current dragging him forward, toward the open doors and the devouring emptiness beyond. "No," he managed to whisper, the sound a dry rasp in his throat, a pathetic rebellion against the inexorable tide. "No!" The word was louder this time, but it held no power. His body continued its slow, inexorable march. Panic was a frantic bird beating against the cage of his ribs. He could see the steps of the bus now, leading down into that suffocating black. He imagined his foot touching that final step and his entire being dissolving, becoming one with the void, another lost soul tethered to this ghastly machine. Then, through the fog of terror, a memory surfaced, sharp and clear as a shard of glass. It was his grandmother's voice, smelling of kimchi and mothballs, her hand warm on his as a child. "Salt protects the living from the dead," she had said, her eyes serious, imparting an ancient wisdom he had dismissed as superstition. "It burns them. It reminds them they are only dust and shadow." Hope, fierce and desperate, flared in his chest. His jacket pocket, the convenience store, the greasy fries he'd bought, the little paper packets of salt he'd stuffed in his pocket without thinking. His hand, shaking with a tremor that was purely his own, fought against the puppeteer's control. It was like trying to lift a mountain. The compulsion wanted him to walk, to surrender, but the memory gave him an anchor. He shoved his hand into his jacket, his fingers clumsy and numb, closing around the fragile paper packets. The break. With a final, desperate surge of will, Seung-ho ripped his hand from his pocket. The paper tore. Crystalline grain spilled across his palm, a stark white against his grimy skin. He didn't hesitate. He didn't aim. He threw it, a clumsy, underhand toss, the motion jagged and broken. The cloud of salt flew through the stale air of the bus, a tiny, mundane blizzard of defiance. It struck the driver. The thing at the wheel screamed. It was not a human sound. It was the shriek of metal grinding on bone, of tectonic plates shifting, of something ancient and hollow being rent apart. It was a sound that vibrated through the floor of the bus and up Seung-ho's spine, a physical assault that threatened to shatter his teeth. The shadowy form of the driver convulsed, flickering like a faulty projection. For a horrifying instant, Seung-ho saw what was underneath, not a person, but a collage of stolen faces and limbs, a writhing knot of despair held together by sheer malevolence. The bus reacted as if it were the creature's own body. It shook violently, a single bone-jarring convulsion that threw Seung-ho against a seat. The interior lights, already dim, flickered wildly, strobing between a sickly yellow and absolute darkness. In the flashes, he saw the driver's form elongating, thinning, its scream dissolving into a high-pitched whine that drilled into his ears. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the control over his body vanished. It was a physical snap, as if 1,000 threads connecting him to the driver had been severed at once. Air rushed into his lungs in a ragged gasp. The strength, the autonomy, flooded back into his limbs, and it was glorious. He didn't wait to see what would happen next. Survival was a singular, screaming instinct. Seung-ho ran. He scrambled down the aisle, his legs feeling both heavy and blessedly light. He didn't aim for the open front doors and the void. He threw his entire body against the emergency release bar on the side window. The mechanism groaned, then gave way with a deafening crack. The door swung outward, and Seung-ho tumbled out with it, not into the nothingness, but onto a shoulder of gravel and weeds. He hit the ground hard, pain flaring in his shoulder and hip, but he didn't register it. The whine from the bus was escalating, reaching an impossible pitch. He scrambled to his feet, mud and sharp stones digging into his palms, and ran. He plunged headlong into the line of trees bordering the road, the darkness of the woods a welcome shield compared to the hungry void. Branches whipped at his face, thorns snagged on his jacket, but he didn't slow. He ran with the ghost scream of the bus driver echoing in his head, a sound he knew would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had broken free, but he was running from a wound, not just a place. Behind him, he heard a final, deafening implosion of sound, and then a silence that was somehow even more terrifying. He just kept running. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs were liquid fire, until the adrenaline gave way to a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. He finally collapsed at the base of a massive oak, sliding down its rough bark into a heap of wet leaves, his body trembling uncontrollably. He lay there, gasping for air, listening to the frantic drumming of his own heart. He was alive. He had survived. But as the silence of the deep woods settled around him, he felt an unnerving certainty that he had not truly escaped. He had only escaped the vessel. The thing that drove it, the void it served, was still out there. And now, it knew his name. The sterile, fluorescent lights of the police station did little to chase away the profound chill that had settled deep in Seung-ho's bones. He sat wrapped in a coarse wool blanket, a cup of untouched tea growing cold in his trembling hands. The world outside the station's windows was beginning to hint at dawn, but for Seung-ho, the night was eternal, a monstrous roaring darkness that still echoed in his ears. The younger officers who had brought him in from the convenience store had treated him with a detached concern, taking his statement with professional skepticism, their pens hovering over words like animalistic roar and screaming engine. But the older officer, Sergeant Park, as his nameplate read, had simply listened. He had not interrupted, had not written a single word. He watched Seung-ho with eyes that held no judgment, only a deep, weary sadness, as if he were hearing a story he already knew by heart. When Seung-ho's frantic, disjointed narrative finally trickled to a halt, the station fell quiet, the only sounds the hum of a computer and the distant wail of a siren. Sergeant Park let the silence stretch, giving the horrors space to settle. Finally, he leaned forward, his voice low and raspy, meant for Seung-ho alone. What you experienced tonight, son. It's a story this city doesn't want to tell, he began, his gaze drifting towards the window as if he could see the dark, slumbering mountain from his desk. My superiors would call it a delusion brought on by exhaustion and shock. They'd log your report as an attempted mugging or a hallucination. But I've been on this force for 30 years. I've heard your story before. Not all of it, not from a survivor. You are the first to get off the bus. He paused, letting the weight of that statement sink in. To understand what happened to you, you have to understand the mountain. Mount Gyeongsan isn't just rock and trees. Old tales, the ones whispered by our grandparents, say the mountain is alive. It's ancient and it's hungry. For centuries, it was a place of reverence, a place you didn't disturb. People left offerings, shamans performed rituals to keep it appeased. But the city grew. We forgot the old ways. We started cutting into its forests, carving roads into its flesh. Seung-ho stared, his mind struggling to connect the dots between ancient folklore and the mechanical terror he had just escaped. The origin of your ghost, Park continued, his voice dropping further, began with progress. In the winter of 1988, there was a project to build a new resort complex deep in the Gyeongsan foothills. It was controversial. It required clearing a patch of forest considered sacred. The locals protested, but money spoke louder than tradition. A bus, the 411, was the primary transport for the construction workers heading up the mountain every day. One night, during the worst blizzard the region had seen in 50 years, the last bus of the day was making its way down the winding mountain road. It was overloaded. Visibility was near zero. The official report says the driver lost control on a patch of ice. The bus skidded off the road and plunged into the ravine. Park closed his eyes for a moment, as if picturing the scene. They couldn't mount a rescue effort until the storm broke 2 days later. By the time they reached the crash site, they found almost nothing. The ravine was notoriously deep and treacherous, a place they called the mountain's throat. The wreckage was mangled beyond recognition, half buried in snow and debris. They recovered a few bodies, but most of the 34 passengers and the driver were simply gone. The official explanation was that the raging river at the bottom of the ravine had swept them away. But the old folks knew better. They said the mountain had swallowed them whole. It had taken its payment for the desecration of its sacred ground. A shudder racked Seung-ho's body. The clues, the disjointed, terrifying moments on the bus began to slot into a framework of impossible logic. That thing you were on wasn't the ghost of a bus, Sergeant Park clarified, leaning in, his eyes intense. It was the mountain itself, wearing the memory of that bus like a mask. It's a lure, a trap made of anger and tragedy. It drives the old route, hungry for more souls to add to its collection. Suddenly, it all made sense. The oppressive, unnatural cold inside the bus wasn't just a chill. It was the raw, ancient coldness of the earth, of a deep and forgotten place. The other passengers, their faces pale and emotionless, their eyes vacant. They weren't ghosts. They were the bait, echoes of the original victims and the 14 others who had been taken since, their spirits enslaved and forced to participate in the hunt, their silent suffering a warning he hadn't understood. The driver, Seung-ho whispered, the image of the hollow-eyed figure burning in his mind. The original driver from the 1988 crash, Park confirmed with a grim nod. He is its conductor, its warden, eternally bound to his failure, forced to ferry souls not to their homes, but into the mountain's heart. The flickering lights, the windows that showed a distorted, nightmarish version of the city. It was never a real bus moving through real space. It was a pocket dimension, a mobile piece of the mountain's spectral consciousness. The distorted views were glimpses into its realm, a place of perpetual shadow and despair. When Seung-ho had tried to use his phone, he wasn't just without a signal. He was entirely outside of the human world. And the roar, that terrible guttural roar that had replaced the sound of the engine, that wasn't a machine. It was the mountain's true voice, raw and predatory, its rage finally breaking through the thin veneer of metal and glass. The words it had screamed at him, "You belong to the mountain now," were not a curse, but a statement of fact. It was claiming him, trying to digest his spirit, to make him another silent, pale passenger for all eternity. He had not simply been on a ride. He had been in the process of being consumed. The 14 missing people, Seung-ho trailed off, were taken, Park finished bluntly. They boarded the bus after midnight just like you. They never got off. Their cases went cold, written off as runaways or unsolved disappearances. No one wants to believe the truth. It's easier to live in a world with explainable tragedies. Seung-ho finally understood the sheer impossibility of his escape. The doors hadn't opened because they were never meant to. The bus was a stomach, and its only exit led to dissolution. Kicking his way out wasn't just breaking a window, it was tearing a hole between worlds, an act of sheer, desperate will that the entity hadn't anticipated. Sergeant Park stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city now bathed in the soft grey light of morning. The formidable silhouette of Mount Gyeong-san loomed on the horizon. "You're free, son, but you're marked. It knows you. An entity like that. It doesn't forget the one that got away. My advice to you, and you must take it as more than a suggestion, is to never go near that part of the city after dark again. Don't take that route. Don't even look at that mountain. You escaped its throat once. It will not let you go a second time." Seung-ho followed his gaze to the mountain. It no longer looked like a beautiful sleeping giant. It looked like a predator lying in wait, its dark peaks jagged and hungry against the dawn sky. He felt a phantom chill, a sense of being watched from miles away. He had survived the bus, but he was left with the horrifying knowledge that the bus was only a single tooth in a much larger and far more patient maw. The night was over, but he knew with chilling certainty that for him, the darkness would never truly be gone. What do you think would have happened to Seung-ho if he had boarded that bus? This story is a modern take on a classic type of urban legend found in many cultures, especially in East Asia. The idea of a ghost bus or a phantom train that appears late at night is a common trope in Korean folklore and Japanese ghost stories, eerie. These tales often serve as cautionary warnings, reflecting a cultural belief that the late hours of the night, specifically after midnight, are a time when the veil between the living world and the spirit world is at its thinnest. The specific rule, "never ride a bus after 2 a.m., grounds the story in this tradition, turning a mundane commute into a potential journey into the supernatural from which there is no return. The boy in the uniform is not just a ghost, he's a chilling omen. What are some urban legends from your city? Let me know in the comments, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next story.